hailed. The ledger waited. Matthias felt the knock before he could make it into meaning. It came not as a demand but as a small, exacting punctuation, 3 measured blows that fell upon the thin wood of the courtyard door like the tapping of a pen. He had been at his desk, the chronicle open to a column of official corrections, a candle guttering in a basin of oil. The room around him full of the trivial noises of home, Lisa sorting a pile of patched shirts, John coughing as he shifted a crate, the far cry of gulls over the river. The sound of the knock arrived and the world shrank to it, as if the city had found a single place to press its finger. Thomas stood on the threshold when Matthias opened the door. He was wrapped in the familiar travel-stained cloak, his cheeks sewn with the day's dust, and he carried the loose, brown parcel that brought the news of the scriptorium in all its variations. He had no expression for these things. That was his trade. News was a shape, and he could give it to a man without dressing it in pity. "For you," Thomas said, and the single line of his voice was an instrument. He held out a folded sheet, sealed with a pressed emblem that had the Chancellor's mark in dull grey. The seal was new, the wax unblemished. Even the smell of the paper oily, faintly metallic from the official ink, seemed to carry the city's authority. Matthias took the sheet and felt, immediately, the same kind of small terror he had felt as a child when his mother set down a bowl of soup that had cooled an intimate disappointment that became something bigger, immediate and physical. He closed the door carefully behind Thomas so that the courtyard's noises could not slip into the room and loosen the moment. Lisa glanced up, a knitting needle resting over her palm like a tiny bright rod. John stood, sleeves rolled, the muscles of his forearms used to labor. They watched him with the instinctive patience that family has for each other's habits of weathering. Matthias slit the seal with a finger and unfolded the parchment. The handwriting was courtly, the language molded to gentle cruelty. It proposed a redaction of the specific ledger entries, to be entered into the chronicle as clerical error, a phrase that would be whispered for generations as the civic equivalent of a blessing. In exchange, the signatory would receive promotion within the scriptorium, a stipend adequate to protect his household, and a formal notice to the magistrates to leave his kin unmolested. The phrasing was careful. It did not demand an oath. It provided an escape clause. On the table, a saucer of tea steamed. The kettle hissed like a little animal. Lisa's fingers splayed over the knitting, as if pressing the wool could hold the world to its smaller, softer rhythms. John's jaw worked. "They ask you to write our safety," he said, voice low and raw with a hurt that was more than the loss of work. "They ask you to lie so we may live as honest men." Matthias tasted the words before he answered. They were not new. The city was a voice so used to speaking in compromises that its syllables had grown familiar. But to call a redaction a lie was to put the thing plainly, and it landed with a weight that made him feel suddenly very small. "It is not only for us," he said, because the proposition was not only about the household. It was also an offer of distance, a way of peeling away from the hot and dangerous center of truth and letting the official myth hold. "There are," he could not finish. The ledger sat in his pocket, heavy and bell-like, an accusation and a promise both. The names in it were not aliases or abstractions. They were carved into the bone of the city, names with dates, with payments couched in the dry language of accounts. They were, in the most literal sense, the dead. Lisa's face folded in her concern and something like fear. She stood and came closer, hands finding his sleeve. "Matthias," she said, simple as a prayer, and then her voice thinned. She had been fragile of late, the coffer winter thing that had not left. "If your signing keeps the tax collector off our doorstep, if it keeps the men from questioning John at the warehouse, then sign it. I have lived to see my children safe. That will be enough for me." Her words fell like a stone. The heat that rose in Matthias was not anger at her, never that, but a small, metal panic that tasted of molten ink. "Mama," he said, "it's not that the chronicle will be untouched. It is that a record will be made false on purpose. The ledger you have always mended things, Lisa interrupted. You make things neat. We eat 'cause you tidy the accounts. I have no wish to be tombstone and story mixed. The living must eat. John, who had spent the day walking the market and the warehouse courts, came then with news that made the room colder. He did not come in by the door used by guests, but through the little gate at the back, shoulders bent as if to make himself smaller under their own eyes. He had a sheet in his hand. He did not look up as he put it on the table. They let me go today, he said. Master Kelv told me at noon no more men are wanted. The ledger he stopped, because he was used to speaking the ledger's name in fragments, like something that might cut him if he summoned it whole. Matthias' thumb found the ledger hidden beneath his shirt. The ledgers of his line had become a disease he carried. He had hidden it from everyone but Edda and a very few confidants. To see John with the dismissal notice, to hear the master's hand in the market's rumour, made everything more bright and terrible. The dismissal could be a dozen things: economy, the master's temper, a petty reckoning. But in the city's new air taught, watchful, the dismissal read less like an accident and more like a pulse. People did not lose their work in such numbers without cause. They watched you at the dock, John said. Men in plain robes asked questions. They looked at me like they thought my mother might be hiding rebels in the stew pot. His voice had the brittle edge of someone forced to joke about a bad dream. They ate in a silence that belonged to the family of people who had once known a bigger fear back when the rebellion still burned the edges of memory. The bread tasted of ash in Matthias' mouth. When he consigned the parchment to the table, laying the Chancellor's offer like a thing whose paper had weight, it seemed to hum. An offer, a closing hand. A payment for oblivion. He wrote at the edge of the sheet the redaction's required phrase, the language they wanted him to use. He wrote it to see the letters with his own hand. The curves and the loops were treacherous in their elegance. Clerical error, corrected by the office of the Chronicle. The ink dried and felt like a scab. If you sign this, Lissa said, and the room tightened again, they will take the trouble of us. They will leave our house alone. We will not starve. And you promotions mean warmth, a better hearth. You could keep ink from clinging to your fingertips. The kettle hissed. Outside, someone walked past, and the stair squeaked as if brand new. The city's noises could now be heard as the rounding of a tribunal. Matthias thought of the names. He thought of Captain Ryan's old face when he had glimpsed a name at the ledger's edge, and how the man's jaw had closed like a trap. He thought of Sister Anwen's soft hands turning the faded oath in the convent's dimness. He thought of the graves Ryan had shown him, small mounds, markers smoothed by weather and neglect. He had seen the ledger's traces made manifest in the earth. To sign would be to put his pen between two fires. He would save his kin from present indignity and possibly worse reprisals. But he would also be the hand that wrote the lie. He would preserve the state's comfortable fiction and make himself complicit in its continuing shape. To refuse would mean risking everything to be certain that the Chancellor's agents would not tolerate half-truths in a time when the state needed a founding myth as a physical thing and could not abide the invisible names. He thought of Edda. She had been more than a confidante. She had been a provocation. She had shown him the convent's margins, had placed a small scrap of a pamphlet in his hand like a lit fuse. She had a fierceness that made the edges of his courage feel blunt by comparison. She wanted the ledger to be set loose, to be a thing that found its way into the city's hands. She thought that truth was a muscle the city needed to flex. Matthias now understood what the exercise might cost. He left the sheet on the table. He washed his hands in a basin, and the water turned the ink faintly blue. Lissa watched him, the worry on her face sharpened into a public crease. If you walk out of this house and go to the magistrates to tell them the ledger is false, she said quietly, they will not simply take you away. They will take all of us, children, Grandchildren, those who owe us favors, will forget us first. The world is built on memory, and it's forgetting. We have only this roof over our heads. A new sound arrived then, the scrape of a boot along the flagstone outside a man's step, slow and deliberate. Thomas had not yet finished his errands. The courtyard gate opened and closed. The sound was a hinge. Someone paused at the outer gate, and there was the soft ordering of gold-threaded robes through the iron. Magister Harrow came without fanfare, his face as carefully unreadable as a seal. "Master Corvin," he said, and the phrase carried the state like a presence in the room. He set his hands on the table, and the parchment he had first handed over lay between them, as if it had been waiting for this exact hand. "We have not much time," Harrow said. He spoke not with menace, but with the placid certainty of a man who believed that institutions spoke for the future. "My lord instructs me to be clear. He values your service, Master Corvin," he would see it continued. "The sign we ask is not for you alone. It will mean that your household is spared the attention of those who would otherwise." Matthias had rehearsed the confession in the quiet hours of the morning, and in the long, late afternoons when light sloughed itself thin across the scriptorium floor. He had gone through variations like a prayer, easier ones in which he spoke of clerical error, briefer ones in which he denied everything, and the hardest in which he told the full, shame-laden story of the ledger and of his family's name written beside sums. None of the rehearsals had made the weight lighter. What they had given him was a map of words to reach the same place, again and again, until the place might somehow be altered. Edda had a way of making rooms smaller and truths bigger. She received him at a corner table beneath an oil lamp that breathed amber light against the gloom. Around them the scriptorium hummed with the last tidying hands, a page turned, a sealing wax cooled on a scrap of vellum, the distant scrape of a chair. Outside, the city murmured, cartwheels over cobbles, a voice calling a child's name, the long, methodical creak of a gate. Inside, the air smelled of ink, lemon oil used to soften leather, and the faint iron tang of old blood that stained more than stone. Matthias' hands would not be still. He smoothed the edge of the ledger in his satchel until the leather softened, and the pencil-worn margins inside felt like an accusation. He told Edda how he had found it misfiled, its spine eaten by smoke and the smell of burn like a private grief, and of the list of names and payments. The precise dates that sat across the ledger like coordinates on a map of collapse. He told her of the margins where a clerk's hand had noted, almost in passing, a phrase that dissolves on sanctimony, terms honored, names transacted. Edda watched him without immediate judgment, her hands, ink-stained as ever, folded around a cup of bitter tea. When she finally spoke, it was to ask the smallest of pragmatic questions. "Have you copies? Has anyone else seen it?" "No," Matthias said. The letters were bird quiet in his mouth. Each word felt like a violation. "Only me. And Sister Anwen a little of the phrasing when she matched the oath. But I have not shown the names." "Good," Edda said. She did not sound pleased. She sounded like a person cataloguing risk. Names changed the pitch of danger. "If you had shown them," her eyes went to the lamp as if the light might flare and uncover secrets like a trap. "If you had shown them, the ledger could be used against us, or against you more quickly." Matthias' confession had not been an unburdening so much as an unwrapping. Each sentence revealed layers beneath what he already felt: shame for the bargain his family had made, responsibility for the clerical duty he had sworn to perform, dread for the knowledge that truth destabilized rather than cleansed. He had loved his father and his grandfather without understanding the mechanism by which love had turned to survival. Now he understood. The ledger named a price. The ledger named his lineage's beneficiary. Edda's response had its own shape of compassion, not softness, but an insistence on clarity. "We will have to think how to proceed," she said. "We must be careful who we trust. The Chancellor's men are not blind. They are patient. Patience is their blade." He told her of the pressure mounting inside the archive, of Galen's summons, of suspicious disappearances of small folios, of rumors of reorganization. He told her of the bribe Jasper's filthy coin, and the offer to alter entries so his name would read clerical error rather than complicit payment, and how it had felt like the easy way out until he pictured the faces in the graveyard. He did not yet know and understood that he could not buy the dead's reprieve at that price. "You think boundaries can be mended with seals," Edda said flatly. "But the seals are gestures, not absolutions. Jasper makes a living by altering the gesture so often that it becomes meaningless. He sells you a cleanliness that is a lie. Then what is left?" Matthias said. The room had shrunk around him, and the words were too large to contain in the cavity of his chest. "Who do we tell? How do we show what happened without starting worse things than silence has yet wrought?" Edda looked at him as if drawing a plan on the map of his face. "There is Sister Anwen and Ryan. But this is not a question of witnesses only. It is a question of audience. The city remembers in pockets. If the names go to the wrong ear first, to those hungry for spectacle, then the result will be a conflagration. But if the names are set where memory can be tended, convents, certain taverns, among those who bury, then the story can live as a slow, tending thing rather than a match held to tinder." She had just said the word that had warred with him from the beginning: memory. The chronicle was meant to manufacture a memory so total that other recollections might wither. But memory was stubborn. It grew in hidden places. If the ledger could be coaxed into those places, perhaps the names might breathe again without provoking a public unmaking. Edda's counsel carried risk and procedure, but it did not carry the intolerable arithmetic that Ryan later put on the table. The soldier arrived after the hour of compline, when the scriptorium's lamps were guttering. Ryan had come at Edda's behest. She had taken the risk of summoning him, and the very fact of that summons was a quiet violence against a man who had hoped to leave the rebellion in the margin of his life. He entered the room with a slow, measured gait, boots making little sound, the pallor of a man who palms his own memory like a wound. "You brought me for counsel, I suppose," Ryan said. He set his hands on the wooden table, a gesture both of arrival and of defense. "Or you wanted me to be a witness?" "Both," Edda said. He brought the ledger. He brought her fingers indicated Matthias, but also the ledger in his satchel on the chair. There is a certain cruelty to the bureaucratic world. Even the staging of confession looked like office procedure. Ryan's face did not change when Matthias explained. Years of arranging grief had set his features into a mask of practical sorrow. He listened, not with the curious mind of a scholar, but with the appraisal of a man calculating consequence. He did not choose pity over principle. Instead, he considered what the ledger might do if it were felt through the city. "Names are blunt instruments in an angry hand," Ryan said finally, and there was no poetry in his voice, only the blunt metal of an assessment. "You cannot give them to a crowd that is hungry for a spectacle. They'll be a hammer, but they can be a medicine in the right hands. The wrong hands and they'll be a weapon." "What do you mean by the right hands?" Matthias asked. He was no soldier. His sense of practical ethics was built out of safe procedures and ink rather than mortars and billets. Those who bury, those who tend graves, those who remember when no one else will. The convents, certain guilds, taverns that shelter the poor. People who will not use names as currency at the market. Ryan's hands made a list in the air. You will not stop the Chancellor by telling everyone. You might destroy a fragile order if you try, but you can ensure that the names exist in places where they will be read softly and read often. That reads like cowardice, Matthias said before he could put the thought to rest. The word felt like a blow, a cheap moral measure, and yet the thought bristled with truth. Isn't the very point of revelation to expose those who do wrong? Exposure is not always justice, Ryan replied, his voice blunt as a trimmed sword. Sometimes it is vengeance, and vengeance is rarely wise. I will not pretend I want the men who sold out our people brought to a public scaffold. I have thought often of killing for old debts, But we are not a people that needs another execution to keep us steady. We need acknowledgement that does not make the living pay for the dead again. He looked at Matthias with an intensity that made the scribe's breath hitch. There was more in Ryan's face than policy. He carried the memory of a unit betrayed, of men who had sown their trust and reaped a trap. You must ask yourself, Ryan said quietly, which violence are you ready to bear? The violence of concealment or the violence of exposure? Matthias saw his family in the two options. He saw his mother's small, careful hands and the way neighbors had learned to avert their eyes so as not to invite scrutiny. He saw his cousin, recently dismissed from a clerk's post, and the way the family's fortunes had balanced on a ledger's fine margin. He understood that exposing the names might topple the fragile gain that had fed his kin for decades. He also understood with a clarity that burned that not telling was to be complicit in a theft of personhood. He had handled people's lives like ink, editing and smoothing, leaving gaps where grief could fit. Now those gaps were not abstract, they were faces. Sister Anwen arrived by invitation in the grey hour when the convent's bells called faintly for prayer. She moved with the soft certainty of someone who spent her life in the company of damaged things, manuscripts with moth tracks, charred reliquaries, hymns wheeled into silence. The convent smelled of beeswax and damp wool, and when she entered the room the only hard sound was the scrape of a hem and the hush of her breath. She listened to the ledger read aloud, letting each name fall into the chapel's hush. The way she read made the names into a litany, and the litany made the ledger into a sacrament. When she came to the words of the corrupted oath, "We shall deliver," she paused long enough that the rain tapped insistently at the mullioned window. They offered a bond in the sight of men and God, and someone turned that bond to their own gain, she said softly. How long can a community live with bargains that eat their flesh from within? We could redress, Matthias said, voice thin. We could expose them and demand reparations, recognition and perhaps kill more, Sister Anwen interrupted. Words can be seeds, but they are also flames. Her counsel was simple and, like the others, unsatisfying. She invoked history the way a surgeon invokes anatomy. It was not to be cruel, but to be accurate. There are ways to tend a wound so it does not become gangrenous. There are ways to mark souls with names, to say them in prayer, to hold vigil, to keep the memory of the wrong from being used as a tool to rip the city apart. But I cannot promise that such tending will be safe. I can only promise that, once spoken, a name refuses to be wholly unheard. They argued then in degrees rather than absolutes. Matthias wanted a single answer, a path that would honor the dead and preserve the living. They could give him nothing of the sort. Instead, they offered scaffolding, slow disclosure through convent networks. Copies slipped into the hands of guilds who attended the poor and thus could bear the knowledge without spectacle. Discreet readings at gravesides. An appendix in an edition of the Chronicle that would be bound in only a few copies, seeded in locations where memory might be kept. Edda spoke of marginalia and subscripted notes. We can introduce the names into the Chronicle in a way that makes them legible to those who know where to look, she said. Not an accusation in the open, but a notation, an appendix, a buried footnote. A name in a place where it will be found by a mind that seeks it, not by a mob, that still risks everything, Matthias said. If the Chancellor declares it a forgery, he will make the very existence of the names a pretext for a purge. Then we must ensure provenance, Edda replied. Multiple copies hidden in separate institutions, the convent, a Guildhall chest, a market tavern in the old quarter. If one is burned, others remain. If a forgery is claimed, the weight of multiple witnesses and copies will be harder to crush. Ryan's answer to that was the most frightening. If the Chancellor moves to crush those copies, people will be hurt. The ones who hide them are not above suspicion. I have friends who still keep watch in the old quarter. They would be in danger. Your household would be in danger, Matthias. The ledger's existence will make you a target. At the mention of his family, his breath came quick and small. He thought of the cup of soup his mother had brought him as a child when he returned wet from the rain, of the small, necessary lies that had kept them warm. He thought of how filial duty had once seemed to him a gentle obligation and how it had hard now into chains. "Then what do you want of me?" he asked Ryan, almost pleading. Ryan's eyes were not unkind. "I want you to know what you set in motion if you move forward. I want you to be ready to accept the costs. I want you to decide whether your conscience is worth their suffering." Matthias had known guilt intellectually. He now found guilt to be a physical thing that could be transferred. It shivered through his limbs and settled behind his teeth. He had always believed that truth was a currency whose exchange rate was unequivocal. You give it, it sets you free. Now he understood that currencies were unstable, and freedom could cost other people's peace. He understood that choices had collateral. They stayed late into the night, the lamplight thinning like the last of a day's confidence. Conversations became schematic: who would hold copies, how to dye inks to simulate age, whether to mark marginalia with an ecclesiastical cipher that only sisters and certain guild clerks would recognize. They wrote lists. They burned a draft with small sparks of wax when they feared it might be found. Every act of secrecy was a wound that made secrecy necessary. And in the hush between plans, Matthias thought of violence. He had read of uprisings in leather-bound chronicles. He had handled the economy of pain at remove. He had not imagined being at the fulcrum of a decision that might tilt into blood. He had never wanted the responsibility. Now it sat in his hands like a ledger balanced on an anxious finger. They ended as plans must sometimes do, not in resolution, but in a pact of small and dangerous things. The name of the tactic irritated him with its cowardice and its cunning, alike an appendix buried in the chronicle. A scattering of copies to convent and guild, and a market scribe in the old quarter who owed him a favor. They would not shout from the battlements. They would whisper where memory might root. If it was forgery, then the weight of multiple witnesses would make the lie less plausible. If it invoked reprisal, then a network of shelters begun by Edda's contacts and bolstered by Ryan's old comrades would hold the immediate fallout. It was not much. It was everything they could devise that did not end in fire. Matthias signed the plan with hands that shook. He had no illusion that it spared his conscience the worst nights. He only knew that if he did nothing, the ledger would rot in silence and the names would not be spoken anywhere, but in the ledger's marginalia. That thought was a slow, corrosive sickness. There is a way guilt teaches its bearer to measure time differently. It expands minutes into reckonings and contracts future options until the only room left is the one of immediate action. When Matthias walked out into the rain, the city smelled of wet stone and peat smoke. The bell of the convent struck, each toll echoing like a careful command. He felt, for a moment, closer to the earth than to the chronicle. He had no idea whether his choice would be salvation or catastrophe. He only had the certainty that it would be consequential. The hook that braided itself to the end of the night was small and ordinary, a messenger breathless in the cold, with a word for him from his mother, a small card folded, delivered with a face that did not meet his. Inside, in the cramped, familiar hand of his mother, was a sentence that had nothing to do with policies or parchments. "We had a man here to ask questions today," it read. "They wanted to know where you were. Be careful." Matthias' stomach went cold. The ledger's shadow had reached the house. He could not pretend now that his bucolic ethics remained intact. He had dragged the ledger's weight into the open to those who could judge, and to those who could help. In doing so, he had also dragged his family nearer to the Chancellor's scalpel. The pact they had made in the scriptorium was a match held to tinder. It might illuminate or it might burn. He closed his eyes and promised, in a voice so small he could barely hear it, to keep the names alive. Whether they would survive because of him or in spite of him, he could not say. But he had learned, in the brittle hush of confession and counsel, that telling was no panacea. The truth was not a tool that solved problems.